Okay, so we're starting Derech Hashem on page 138 of the Naaman edition, which is Chelik Aleph, Perek Hey, Oz Beis, section 1, chapter 5, number 2. So last week we were talking a little bit about the different parts of creation. We mentioned that there's a physical world and a spiritual world, and we had different parts of the physical world. We had the constellations in the skies, that there is some significant purpose to them besides their physical reality that we have. We're going to discuss that later. And then we talked about the spiritual world, that the spiritual world consists of various parts. So far we mentioned kochos, which are certain ways, we'll say, that Hashem deals with the world. There's a discussion, Rabbi Naaman has a discussion in the back of his edition of Derech Hashem, if the kochos are created beings or not created. It sounds like from here that they are created, but from other places it sounds like they are not creations, but rather expressions of Hashem's will. Then we learned that there's something called malachim, which we translate as angels, which are spiritual messengers that carry out what Hashem wants. Then we learned that there is something called a neshama. A neshama is something that was created by Hashem, that we all have. That is the part of us which desires to get close to Hashem. And we said that while animals have souls also, they only have a nefesh, which is a very physical type of soul, whereas only human beings have this very spiritual created soul that yearns to get close to Hashem. And then we also talked about shadim, which were demons, certain negative spiritual forces, and we'll talk more about them. So now the Ramchal is going to go into more detail about certain aspects of the spiritual world, and that's where we're picking up from. So, Hanivroim Hagashmiim, Yiduim Hem Etzleinu. The physical world, we know about it. And we all know the physical laws, right? We know from just being around, some more than others, the laws of gravity, the liquid state of matter, the physical state of matter, things like that. Acharuchanim, right? We can, everything in the physical world, not everything, most things in the physical world we can measure and we can observe, and we have some understanding of it, a relationship with it. However, when it comes to describing the spiritual world, spiritual matters, it's impossible for us to get a good understanding of it, because it's outside of our imagination. So anytime we talk about these spiritual things, the only thing we can talk about it in reference to is our Masorah, is our tradition. The things in the spiritual worlds, we really don't have an understanding of what they are. Right? For example, it exists on a different plane of existence. So I always say the comparison would be, you have someone who is blind from birth. Now describe to that person the difference between red and blue, right? You can't do it because there's no frame of reference. It's blue because it's blue. It's like the sky. Well, he never saw the sky. It's red. It's impossible to do. So when it comes to the spiritual world, we don't have a connection with it that we can really have a good, solid understanding. All we know about the spiritual world is from what we have from our tradition, from our Masorah, from what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, they told the Jewish people in Sinai. That's the only way we can understand these aspects of the spiritual world. Now that doesn't apply to everything. When it comes, we mentioned, the Ramchal himself mentioned earlier, when it comes to understanding Hashem, the existence of God, we know that from our Masorah, but we also know that from logic. Logic dictates that there has to be a God, one God who created everything. That's something we discussed in past classes. But when it comes to the details of the spiritual world, we only know it according to our Masorah, according to our tradition. And it was interesting. I think when the Russians first went into space, they were atheists, the Soviets, and I think Khrushchev said something like, the astronauts went to space and they didn't see God. It's like such a silly thing, assuming God, they might have made it, I assume they didn't mean it as a joke, but God is like totally beyond the physical and is even, not even spiritual, is beyond that. So to say that, you went to the heavens and you couldn't see anything spiritual is utterly ridiculous, because it exists on a different plane of existence. That's my second favorite story of the Russians in space. My first favorite story is that the Americans spent allegedly millions of dollars trying to invent a pen that would work without gravity in space. And you know what the Russians did? They used a pencil. So I thought that's my favorite story about the Russians in space. Okay, Vihine. Min ha'ikarim ha'gedolim shebiyadenu be'inyan zeh hu shekeneged kol ma shenimtza b'nimtzaim hashvalim nimtzaim l'mala kochos nivdalim. What a big principle that we know about this is that everything which exists in the physical world has a source in the spiritual world amongst the kochos nivdalim, amongst these kochos, these what he translates like supernal forces, these transcendent forces. Everything in the physical world has a spiritual source in the spiritual world from the kochos. Shemehem mishtalshalim v'yotzim, from that high level in the spiritual world, it comes down. B'seder echad shel ishtalshalos. The way he has a really cool word here. I've never heard it. The only time I've ever seen this word is in this translation of Derech Hashem. Concatenate. Concatenate. I don't know if anyone. I'm probably mispronouncing it, and don't blame my yeshiva education because I went to public school, so nothing to do with why I can't pronounce it. But basically the kochos start at the very high spiritual level, and then it comes down to lower spiritual realms until we get to the physical world, and it's all connected. The way that Hashem decreed. The things in the lower worlds and what happens to them. So we find that these kochos, these spiritual forces, are the source of everything which exists in the physical world. The things that exist in the physical world are branches, and they are produced by these spiritual forces. And they're connected like rings on a chain. So you have like the kochos, and then you have the lower spiritual worlds, and they connect, like the bottom of one world connects to the top of another world, so it's like a chain, and it goes all the way down until it's in the physical world, which we can sense with our senses. Now, even the world right above us, which would be the lowest spiritual world, it's still too spiritual for us to have any connection to. We can't see it or sense it or anything like that. So we all have so everything in the world, it's not just like Hashem created a spiritual world over here and he created a physical world over here, but rather he created a spiritual and physical world that is totally interconnected. Okay. Od Masaras Biyadenu, we have another Kabbalah, we have another tradition. She'al kol etzem v'chol mikra shebenimtzaim hashvalim ha'ele hufkedu pkidim min hasuga malachi shezacharnu l'mala. That everything in this world, everything in the lower worlds, has an angel that was appointed to watch over it, to watch over. I don't know. To watch over maybe is not the right word, but they have an appointed angel. Shezachar l'mala umasam lekayim ha'etzem hahu or mikra hahu b'manimtzaim hashvalos kfi ma shehu u'lechadesh mashor elischadesh b'shvalim kfi hagzera elyena. And the mission of these angels, of these malachim, is to sustain what's in the lower world, and to carry out whatever Hashem decrees that should happen in the lower world. So, for instance, he quotes the Medrash, famous Medrash, there's no blade of grass that doesn't have a mazel in heaven saying it, you should grow. Right? According to the Medrash, every blade of grass has a malach which says grow. So I think he makes the point here, it's made in other places. It's a little off topic. We talk about hashgacha pratis, that Hashem watches over each individual human being, right? How rewards and punishment for each person. I think he's going to talk more about this later, based on a person's deeds. But when it comes to other animals and other creations, other things in creation, that's not the case. While there is a malach that's appointed, let's say, on all the cows, each cow, Hashem doesn't watch over each cow. Did this cow, do well grazing today? It's going to be rewarded with extra milk. Or, this cow didn't do well. But the entire hashgacha on the animals is just that there should be cows. It's on the species as a whole. Hashem watches over the species as a whole, that there's no specific watching over, this cow should survive and this cow should die, but rather cows in general should continue to exist for whatever reason, and different things will happen. Okay. Fine. Gimel. The Amnam. Ikar Metzius Ha'olam Umatzavo Ha'amiti Hu Bakochas Hahem. The main reality is in these kochos, these kochos elyonim, these high sources. V'toldos masha behem hu masha begashmim hashvalim, and the effects of and what comes out of these kochos is in the lower world. So the main aspect of creation, where like, I don't know, decision where things happen, that's in the spiritual world, and what happens in the physical world is just a reflection of what happened in the spiritual world. V'zeh bein b'masha tchilas habriya, bein b'masha mischadesh. Whether we're talking about what happened at the beginning of creation, or we're talking about whatever happened during the course of time. V'hainu, kikfi ma shenivra min hakochos hahem, ukfi hasider shenizdru v'hagvulim shehugvulu, kach haya ma shenishtalsha achar kach lefi chokam ishtalsha shratz habar yizbarach shemo. Whatever happens in the kochos, it will carry down to that chain that we talked about, and it will affect whatever's happening in the lower spheres. And whatever happens within those spiritual forces, and whatever is created, or whatever is new that is made with those spiritual forces, will come down into the physical world. Haseder v'chol shar ha'avchanos b'kochos im kfi ma sheshayich behem lefi amitas and yanim v'hametzius v'hamatzev v'haseder v'chol shar ha'mikrim b'shvalim mishnalsho v'netak l'ma sheshayich behem lefi amitas and yanim. That everything, the main stuff that is happening in the spiritual world, and it's only being affected in the physical world. Okay, any questions or comments thus far? Disagreements with me? Not with the Ramchal. Can't disagree with the Ramchal, you can disagree with me. Okay. So let's go. It's interesting also, just as a side point, that he says whether it's this constantly, the spiritual world is constantly interacting with the physical world, and that Hashem is constantly giving his, as Nefesh Chaim discusses, giving his sustenance to the world. Like, it's not just that Hashem created the world and that's it, now the world exists based on inertia, but every moment Hashem is constantly creating the world, which I forgot who mentions this, but that means even at the time when a person sins and is in essence rebelling against God, God said don't do this, and this person is doing it anyway, God is creating him at that point, allowing him to rebel against him, which I always thought was the tremendous chesed of Hashem, that he actively, it's not just a passive thing, he's actively creating that person, allowing him to rebel against him at that time. But you kind of see a similar thing here about Hashem creating the world, and that is constantly creating it. Okay, Dalet. V'hine, lefi shor zeh, according to this klal, tchilas kol ha'havayos, lamala b'kochos elyonim. The beginning of all existence is in these kochos. That's the source of everything. V'sofu lamata b'shvalim, and the end is our lower world. V'chein tchilas kol ha'nyanim ha'mischachim, and everything new that happens. The source, lamala v'sofu lamata. The source of everything is in the kochos, and the source of everything new that happens is in these kochos. Amnam prat echad yesh yotzim min haklal. However, there's one exception. Anyone want to take a guess what the exception is? We're saying the source of everything is in these kochos and directly affects what happens in the lower world, except for one thing. Any guesses? Okay. V'hu ma shenogeh lebechiroso shel ha'adam. When it comes to man's free will. When it comes to man's free will, whether to choose to do a mitzvah or to choose to do an avera, that is our decision. We have no external force which is causing us to do it. It's all us. No spiritual force forcing us to do something. Right? When the grass grows, the grass is growing and the grass exists because it has a source in the spiritual world. But when it comes and it grows, it does that action of growing because it has that source in the spiritual world. When it comes to us deciding, am I gonna put on tzitzis or not put on tzitzis? Am I gonna eat the bacon cheeseburger or not eat the bacon cheeseburger? There is no spiritual force which is forcing me to do anything. It is entirely me having that bechira, having that free will to do that. That's the only exception to this rule. Since God wanted people to be able to choose between good and evil, right? As we discussed earlier why God created the world like that, but that's what he did. He created the world that man has a choice between good and evil. He made it that people are not dependent on anything else for this. V'adrab, on the contrary, nasan like kayach lios menia laolam atzmo v'livriosav kfima sheyivchor b'chavtzo. He empowered man to have an effect on the world. Meaning, not only does the spiritual world not cause man to choose between good and evil, but when man chooses between good and evil, which is totally his independent choice, that choice will actually affect the world. I think he's going to get more into it, but this is something which is discussed in the Nefesh HaChaim at great length, and in other Sfarim, I believe, that when a person chooses to do good or evil, just like we mentioned that chain going from down top to bottom of how, let's say, that there's physical grass. So that physical grass, its source is in the spiritual world, and that source of the grass starts in the spiritual world, and it comes down as a chain until the physical world. So there's a chain going in the opposite way, that when a man or woman, a person, chooses to do good or chooses to do evil, that he also has a chain, and his actions affect the spiritual world above. It can cause destruction in the spiritual world, or it can create worlds in the spiritual world. That's why, famously, the Nefesh HaChaim cites that what Titus, the Roman emperor, when he destroyed the temple, he took a prostitute and unrolled the Torah in the Holy of Holies and had relations with her in the Holy of Holies. It says that when a person has a bad thought, that it's worse. When a Jewish person has a bad thought, it's worse than what Titus did, because what he did, well, it has to do with also, he's going to say that after the giving of the Torah, it was only the Jewish people that have the spiritual effect. So when a Jewish person has an evil thought and does an Avera, that affects the spiritual world, while as what Titus did was just a physical action that had no connection and didn't destroy the spiritual worlds. Okay, let's continue a little bit. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to stop me. And if you're shy, you can always put a question in the chat. Okay. We find that there are two opposite movements in the world. Ha'achas tivis muchrachas ve'ashniya bechiris. We have the forced actions and the free will actions. Ha'achas melamala lamata. One is from top to bottom. Ve'ashniya melamata lamala, and the other one is from bottom to top. Man's free will. Ha'muchrachas hi ha'tenua shemis noyaim hashvalim me'hakochos elyonim. The top to bottom is the lower worlds, the physical world, being affected by the upper world, the source of their movement and their existence. V'hine, himelamala lamata, that's from top to bottom. Habechiris, the free will, himasha adam einiya bebechirasa, that's what a man affects with his free will. V'hine, mashihu meiniya, efshar sheyeh ela geshem min hagashmim. What man can do is only physical, right? We're physical beings. We can only do physical things. Ki ha'adam gashmi u'maisav gashmi, and we are physical and our actions are physical. Aval mipnei ha'kesher ve'yitztarfus hanimsa ben ha'kochos alyonim v'hagashmim. But because of this connection that we discussed of the spiritual world to the physical world, hine bihisnai'eya hagashmi yagia behemshech ha'ispailos al ha'koach ha'elyon she'alav. Through this connection of the spiritual world, when a man does a physical action, it affects that spiritual world. So even though our actions, everything that we do, is by definition physical, when we do that, since we have this connection to the spiritual world, it affects the spiritual worlds that are above us. And that this movement is from bottom to top. The opposite of the top to bottom, which we discussed before. So again, there are spiritual chains, starting from the spiritual world to the lower world. For everything which exists in the physical world, the source is in the spiritual world. That's a top to bottom. And when we have free will, that affects the spiritual world. That's from bottom to top. Ve'ulam tzarach sheteda, you have to know. Ki gam ha'adam atzmo ein kol ma'asav bechirim. All of a person's actions are not based on his free will. Meaning man doesn't have choice to do anything he wants. This might be very shocking to some people. Aval yesh mehem shiu mitzad bechiraso. Excuse me. He says that there are certain actions of humans that they have free choice to do, and there are certain actions that people are forced to do. So Rabbi Naaman here quotes the Maimer HaIkrim, which is another sefer from the Ramchal. He says that any action that a person has to do, that is a choice to do a mitzvah or an avera, a sin or a commandment, that's free will, and it's totally up to you whether you do it or not. When it comes to Yirah Shamayim, Hakol B'dei Shamayim Chutz Mi Yirah Shamayim, that's total free will. But when it comes to other actions that are not a mitzvah or not an avera, it could be that we're being forced to do that Hashem is forcing us to do that. The reason He may be forced to doing us certain things is, the Ramchal says here, because it might be relevant to reward and punishment, or it might be relevant to the maintenance of the human race. So when it comes to any action which is relevant to mitzvos or averos, that is a lot. It's not just like putting on tefillin or not putting on tefillin. It could be I'm eating and I'm thinking about serving Hashem, or I'm going to eat and not think about serving Hashem. That's also a mitzvah and avera. Certain thoughts we might have, or things we might say. But when it comes to actions which have no connection to mitzvahs or averas, it could be that we're being forced to do them, and we don't have free will when it comes to that. V'ulam b'meshehu nimshach achar hagazera she'alav. It's like everything else in the world. And those actions which affect us that are not relevant to Yirah Shamayim, that has that's in the way we were discussing of from top to bottom. According to the way that the higher forces made it. But when it comes to our free will, that is from bottom to top. So again, just to summarize, everything that exists in the physical world has a source in the spiritual world, and everything that is affected in the physical world, it's because something happened in those high spiritual levels to affect it. So that's a top to bottom model. There's one exception. When it comes to man's decision to do a mitzvah or an avera, to decide between good and evil, even though all the actions he's doing are physical, that affects the spiritual world because of that connection, and that is a model of bottom to top. And even actions which man does that are but they're not relevant to mitzvahs or averos, that could be or is forced on him by Hashem, and that is also a top down model. A lot of heavy stuff there. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, thanks for coming. Glad everyone could make it, and thank you to Leah Goldman as always.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
as always.
Thank you.
Very clear and precise. We enjoy your shares. Very good. Very good.
I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you to Leah Goldman for organizing as always.
Thank you, Leah.